So welcome. I'm super excited to be talking to you about this topic, the building blocks of sales agility. There's just so much buzz in our industry right now about agility and what it means and how salespeople can become more agile. And when we talk about agility, I'd like to begin by really sharing a little bit more about what do we mean by agility? What does it mean to be agile? And a definition I think that we can all get our arms around is this idea that if you're agile, you need to have the ability to adapt your behavior based on the situation you're facing. So salespeople need to be agile. Lots of people need to be agile. And when you think about the conditions that are taking place in our world right now with this pandemic, right? Talk about the need to be agile, right? When situations change, organizations and people that are more agile, they thrive, right? People who can't make adjustments struggle. And the need for agility is only going to become more important, more prevalent as time goes by. And earlier this morning, Jennifer Stanley of McKinsey & Company actually identified agility as a really important characteristic that salespeople need in order to get the best answers for customers, to be this omni-channel orchestrator, if you will. And so I'm going to share in some research that we've done. And I'm going to give you the punchline first, and then I'm going to unpack the research journey that got us to this punchline. So the punchline is that there's different kinds of agility. There's organizational level agility, there's situational agility, and then there's foundational agility. And when you think about what this means for you, we're going to describe not only the research that went into the identification of these different levels of agility, but what it means and what it can mean for you as a sales enablement person or a sales professional to determine where are you right now and what do you need to do in order to move in that direction toward agility. So we're going to share this research journey. We didn't know that it was an agility research journey when we started it. We were just researching high-performing sales managers and high-performing salespeople. And over time, we started seeing these common themes. And these common themes are going to come through loud and clear in our research findings and what it means for these different levels of agility. So there was a series of studies that we did that have been published in our books, Cracking the Sales Management Code and Crushing Quota. And there was a series, there was a study on sales metrics, a study on sales coaching, and then a study on sales management practices. And the first study that we did was we examined lots of metrics that very large global organizations use to measure and manage their sales force. And we thought we were going to identify all of these best practices. And what happened is that we just saw a bunch of chaos. And we had to spend all this time sorting through this chaos to see, are there any patterns in these metrics? And what we learned as we started really examining these metrics is there was a really important question that we then started to use to guide our thinking and identifying patterns in this data. And we eventually came up with this management framework based on this research that really proves the point that there really is no one-size-fits-all approach to measuring and managing a sales force, right? So how do we determine what we measure and how we manage it? Well, it depends on which business results we're targeting, which sales objectives or KPIs are necessary to achieve those results, and then which sales activities have to be executed consistently well in order to achieve those objectives and ultimately those results. So that was the outcome of our first study on the sales metrics. One of our next studies, we examined the most prevalent types of sales coaching available in the marketplace. We took a look at capability coaching, which is about developing seller skills and knowledge, think the GROW model. Outcome coaching, assessing a seller against target results, think pipeline scrubbing. And we also explored activity coaching, influencing seller actions and behaviors. And we took a look at the degree to which when sellers receive these different types of coaching, it impacted their performance. And when managers provided these types of coaching, how did it impact quota attainment on their team? And our findings were pretty darn surprising. Coaching and capabilities, which we imagine would be pretty highly correlated with quota attainment, was almost negligible. Only a 2% impact on quota attainment or variation in quota attainment. Coaching for results, a little higher, 10% variance in quota attainment. But activity coaching was by far the most impactful and the only one, quite frankly, that was statistically significantly correlated with quota attainment. And activity coaching is by far the most powerful. But which activity should you coach? Well, again, that depends. So when we add these two research studies together with our management practices research, we realize there's this level of agility at the organizational level. So organizations that are agile have to be able to link desired results to sales objectives or KPIs and ultimately salesperson activities. That alignment is critical in order to ensure agility. When things change, right, we have to identify new activities in order to accomplish certain objectives and ultimately results. Then if we consistently coach through these high impact activities and then monitor leading indicators of success and make adjustments as needed, these are the types of decision-making frameworks that drive organizational agility in the sales force. So let's continue on our research journey. About the time that we were publishing Cracking the Sales Management Code, there was another series of research studies being conducted by the Florida State University Sales Institute. And they have a consortium of companies that participate. And back in 2012, they commissioned a study to determine, what is the best sales methodology? Is it challenger? Is it consultative selling? What is it? And why? And they also examined, do high performers actually, do they display more adaptive behaviors than everyone else? And when they adapt, does this actually improve win rates? So some really interesting findings came out of this study that we've also been able to validate through our research at Vantage Point. So the first thing was that high-performing sellers do not display one pattern of behavior. There's no one best methodology that's better than any other. In fact, there's 4 patterns of sales behavior or 4 different strategies that salespeople engage in order to pursue opportunities and win sales. There's a consultative, a disruptive, think challenger, competitive, and financial, think ROI value selling. So 4 different patterns of selling and not one. So how does this unfold with high-performing sellers versus everyone else? Well, first of all, let's take a look at what low and average performing sellers did in this research study. They were presented with different buying situations that were industry specific, but very different from each other. So for example, low and average performing sellers would use a consultative approach in buying situation 1. Well, guess what? They use a consulting approach again in buying situation 2, 3, and 4. What the researchers found is that low and average performing sellers use one approach, and it's the approach they've been trained on. High performing sellers do something different. They identify and assess the buying situation, and then they choose a pattern of selling behavior that increases their chances of a win in that buying situation. So for buying situation 1, it might be consultative. Buying situation 2 could be disruptive or a challenging oriented approach. Buying situation 3, a financial or value-driven approach. And buying situation 4, a competitive or product-based approach. So high performers actually display what we would call situational agility. They assess the buying situation, and then they select the right set of selling tactics or sales patterns in order to increase the chances of a win in that buying situation. So what are the conclusions here that this research team came up with? Each sales organization faces between 4 and 6 unique buying situations, and they differ even within industries. High-performing sellers display 4 different sales strategies, not one. And there's some really other interesting things that came up that I'm going to tell you about in just a minute. But these findings really indicate a level of agility that we call situational agility, being able to assess and read the buying situation you're facing, and then choose and execute that pattern of selling behavior that's most likely to lead to a win. So does this mean that all sellers should be trained on situational agility? Probably yes, but there's a little bit more to the story. So we continue with the research and we go back to our research journey. And the next few questions that we wanted to have answered were, this Florida State University Sales Institute, when they did this research, they identified up to 25 buying factors that they analyzed in order to do this research around this situational agility. And that's really not a good message to send a salesperson. All you have to do is go figure out these 25 things, and then you can determine what buying situation you're facing. So we thought there's got to be an easier way to go about this. So we started really interrogating the data to determine, how do we make more sense of these different buying factors in a way that sellers can actually execute easily, or execute, maybe not easily, but a little more easily than a complex message of 25 buying factors. And then these 4 patterns of behavior, or these 4 sales strategies of consultative, disruptive, financial, and competitive, how do they fit together? How do they align? Are there any connections between those? So something really interesting came out of these next few studies. The first one around buying factors, buyers are complicated. When we started really looking across all these different factors that we've been collecting data on, we realized there's a few of them that really almost never come up. So we were able to reduce that number down to a more manageable number. And then we started seeing patterns in those buying factors. And the patterns were that they fall into these 5 categories of buying factors. So problem awareness, competitive landscape, customer dynamics, the buying process, and then solution definition. Every factor that we examine falls into one of these categories. So, okay, now we have something that's a little bit more manageable, right? We have these 5 categories of buying factors, not 25 buying factors. But something else came up that was really interesting. And it was really interesting to us, and it caused us to ask a lot more questions. So there was this one buying factor that was significant in all buying situations in our research. Only one that came up every single time. It was statistically important in every single analysis that we did. And this is the buying factor called buying stage. So at what point in that buyer's journey, or in that buying team's journey, did the seller engage with that buying team? Was it early in the buying process when they were identifying needs? Was it midway through the buying process where they were establishing decision or buying criteria? Was it a little later when they were assessing solutions? Or was it very late stage when they were sort of mitigating risk and negotiating? So this idea of buying stage is important for multiple reasons. Number one, if you're going to align your behavior and be agile, you have to understand, how does a buyer navigate a buying journey? And are there predictable elements to that? And the answer is yes, there are. There's a lot of information out there and research around buying psychology and decision psychology. And what we know is that buyers have different goals early in their buying process than they do midway through their buying process, than they do later in their buying process. And different things motivate them at different stages of their buying journey. So this idea of buying stage or buying journey was a really critical and foundational piece to this idea of situational agility. But what does it really mean? How does it enable the situational agility? Well, buying stage, understanding where the buyer is in their buying journey, is pretty critical to then understanding that different buyers have different journeys, right? If you don't understand a buying journey, it's pretty darn hard to understand that different journeys differ, right? So it's sort of a foundational element to the idea of situational agility. And we also know that buying stage, or identification of the buyer stage, is critical to determine which of these 4 sales plays should I run, right? So you have this as a foundational element that has to be understood and applied in order to then be able to advance to this level of situational agility. So now what we have is we have some insights. We know that buying stage is foundational. We also know that consultative selling, this is another analysis that we did, the consultative tactics within, the tactics within consultative selling, are highly correlated with each of the other sales strategies. So not only is buying stage foundational, but if you're going to start, consultative is the way to start. And it's also interesting because when we shared our agility research that came out of the Florida State Sales Institute, a lot of our clients say, well, wait a minute, what about the training we've already done? We've done spin selling, we've done challenger, what do we do with that? And the answer is actually a really good answer. The answer is consultative selling is not dead. It's never going to be dead. It's still really important. And you have to have a solid foundation of consultative in order to be able to run some of these more complex strategies like disruptive, competitive, or financial. So now we know that there are different levels of agility. Agility is not a one-size-fits-all affair. And when you think about your organization and you think about your sales force, or you think about yourself as a seller, do you have foundational agility? Do you understand buyer psychology in the buying journey? Do you understand that buyers behave differently at different stages along their journey, right? And this idea of foundational agility is necessary. It's a necessary contributing factor to this next stage of situational agility. Because if I understand that buyers have a journey, I can then understand that different buying teams for different opportunities have different journeys. So there's the foundational level, the situational level, and then there's this organizational level. So organizations that have these frameworks around linking activities with KPIs and organizational results are much more agile because they can switch gears easier and more effectively and shift activities to align with changing results and changing conditions. So we have these three primary levels of agility that came out of this agility journey that we didn't even know we were on. We were just studying what high performers do, and we found some really interesting insights. And then our friends at the Florida State University Sales Institute contributed a tremendous amount of great insight regarding this middle piece of situational agility. And we were able to look at, how do these two other types of agility kind of come together and package the kinds of organizational agility that sales forces need. So the next question you're probably wondering is, well, how do you become agile? I understand that there's three different levels of sales agility. There's foundational, there's situational, and there's organizational. But how do you actually become agile? Well, how do we act on this information? Well, that's interesting. And the research team had to look outside of the sales domain because at the time the studies were conducted, nobody was teaching sales agility. So they had to look at the military, at sports teams, and first responders to see, what's the secret to training people in a position where agility is needed, right? Certainly first responders, fighter pilots, and athletes, particularly, team athletes, certainly need agility. So what they found was that there's these three core pillars to agility. There's this idea of situational intelligence, or being able to read the situation, situational readiness, or determining, what's the best path or standard operating procedure given this situation, and then how do I execute these decisions that I make? So for a fighter pilot, they have to assess the situation and compare it to other situations they've faced. They actually keep a log called a DOPE log, data on previous engagements, so that they're constantly staying on top of different situations that they encounter, right? They determine the best path of action, and they develop standard operating procedures around that. And then they execute that action, and then they monitor impact to see how the situation is changing. So these three core elements of agility apply in the military, they apply with first responders, they apply with professional athletes, and guess what? They apply to salespeople and sales managers as well. So when we think about foundational sales agility, how do these three pillars unfold? Well, you have to assess where the buyer is within their buying journey. What is their buying stage? And what does that mean about their likely objectives? You have to plan your interaction according to their buying stage and then execute that interaction effectively. And then, of course, monitor buyer reactions by getting feedback. So there's this idea of assess the buying stage, plan accordingly, and execute your conversation and monitor buyer reactions. So how is that different than situational agility? Well, situational sales agility, you're assessing the buying situation factors, including buying stage, right? You're choosing which pattern of selling behavior or which sales strategy is the most likely to be effective given the buying situation that you face. And then you execute the tactics within that strategy, constantly monitoring buyer reactions and getting feedback to reassess as the situation changes. If we take a look at organizational sales agility, right? We have to align sales activities with organizational results, consistently coach to these high impact activities, and monitor leading indicators of progress and make adjustments as needed. So these three levels of agility are what drive the best outcomes in the sales organization. So you're probably wondering, well, so what? This is really interesting. Thanks for sharing this. Haven't really looked at agility like this before, but why would I do it? Why would I go through the hassle or the effort of attaining these different levels of agility? Well, let's take a look at some of the impacts these different levels of agility have. Organizational agility, when sales leaders and sales managers utilize frameworks like the one that I shared, they get 35% more of their sellers to quota. That's just one example of the impact of that kind of organizational agility. Situational agility, 20% more revenue per seller, one example. Foundational agility, 30% increase in average selling price. And none of these metrics are things we would sneeze at, right? They're all pretty darn impressive. Now they differ by company, they differ by industry, but they always show improvement. So the challenge now is how to determine within your own organization, do you have foundational agility in place? As a salesperson, do you have foundational agility? Are you familiar with buyer psychology and the buying process and what buyers go through at different stages and what that means for how to align your efforts? You know, as an organization, are you helping equip your people to be situationally agile? Do you understand the buying factors that most significantly impact the buying situations your salespeople face? And do you know which sales plays are most effective when run in those buying situations? How do you know? Where's the information? From an organizational perspective, are you aligning sales activities with organizational results? Are you ensuring that sales managers are coaching those activities consistently well? And are you monitoring leading indicators to determine if the right progress is being made and making adjustments? So these three levels are necessary in order to actually equip and ensure an agile sales organization. So if you're interested in this topic, which I hope you are, we're fascinated by it. We're getting ready to write another book about it. There's some actions you can take. First of all, you can read an article on how to develop an agile sales force. Talks about a lot of the research that we've talked about here. You can also read a deep research study about sales agility. It was actually done by the Florida State Sales Institute. You can watch a video about crushing quota, and that's a little bit about some of the surprising findings that we found in our research on sales managers, including some pretty shocking things like managers that are the most successful don't spend more time in the field, they don't coach more hours, they coach differently. You can also contact me directly. So if you have questions that we're not able to answer in this session, feel free to reach out to Vantage Point and contact us.